Okay, good morning, everyone. As per the usual format of muted everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you so wish to ask anything. And thank you so much, as always, for joining. The topic we were looking at, we began speaking about last week, was that of the Torah SheBaal Peh, the so-called oral law. And there's lots of questions around around Torah SheBaal Peh. What do we know about it? Where does it come from? What are the parameters of Torah SheBaal Peh? What do we claim is included in Torah SheBaal Peh? Does it include every word of Mishnah, every line of Gemara? How is it transmitted? Was it always being kept in the way we know it? And what can we say about the accuracy of its transmission, which certainly is the big question over here. I mentioned last week, we know it's been the subject of debate over many generations. The Cushim, the Samaritans, the Tzaddokim, the Sadducees, the Karaim, the Karaites, and perhaps in more modern times, elements of the Reform movement and others have questioned the authority of the Torah SheBaal Peh, questions its reliability. So what we can say about it is clearly it's clearly something important to discuss. And if we look at the makeup of what we call Yiddishkeit, 50% plus of what we do, if not 80% plus, really comes via Torah SheBaal Peh. So Torah SheBaal Peh includes halachas which aren't found at all in Torah Shebechsav, or clarification of halachas which are found in the written Torah. So much of what we call what we call Yiddishkeit, what we call Judaism, comes from Torah SheBaal Peh. So last week we looked at several thoughts around this idea. The first thing we discussed was where we see reference to Torah SheBaal Peh in the written Torah, and I shared various sources that demonstrate from the written Torah itself the necessity of a Torah SheBaal Peh. And this is really very old conversation in that sense. It's found in the Gaonim and their polemics against the Karaites, the Karaim. It's found in the Kuzari, very classic sources that talk about the impossibility of a written Torah without some element of oral tradition. Now, starting at the beginning, we built this up step by step. On the most basic level, the nature of every work, in a sense, is Baal Peh, is oral. We often don't realize this, but when we read a book, when we read a work of fiction, a work of fact, there's always certain assumptions we come into with it which are Baal Peh, which are oral. We then spoke about even the knowledge of the letters and how to pronounce letters and what the letters are, the meaning of words. All of that is oral by definition. So in that sense, you can't be a purist denier of Torah SheBaal Peh. One has to acknowledge there's some oral element to it. There's no really way of avoiding it. And in a sense, this is Hillel's argument when the want to be ger comes to him and says, just teach me the written Torah, and he says you can't even work out the letters of the Torah without knowing it. And then we got into the unique issues of Torah, the fact that it's an unvoweled system, so we don't even know how to vowel the letters. The Sefer Torah as written is unpunctuated. We need the oral tradition for passing the sentences. And then a series of mitzvahs which are incomprehensible without an oral Torah, from tefillin and tzitzis to shofar, yom teruah, which instrument, the arba minim, the calendar system, the laws of justice, mishpat, shoftim, which would be incomprehensible, the laws of divorce and marriage, a whole series of mitzvahs which would be incomprehensible without a Torah SheBaal Peh. And finally, the idea that the Torah itself references an oral Torah, particularly when it comes to mitzvahs which need an oral tradition by definition, like shchita. The Torah says, you should slaughter it in the way I've commanded you. And shchita is a very good example of something that's vocational. It's not something which can be taught really from the book. It's something which has to be shown. I then spent some time sharing some of the archaeological finds which we have, which demonstrate the practice, push back the practice of Torah SheBaal Peh, certainly to 2,000, even 2,500 years ago, whether it's from the Dead Sea Scrolls and references to them, Josephus, who we discussed, the Septuagint, the translation of the Torah that was translated into Greek, and also, here I need to correct something, also a Kesuvah, a marriage document from what's called the Elephantine papyri. So the Elephantine papyri, the background to this, which I didn't have time to sufficiently explain last time, was a collection, an incredible collection of manuscripts based upon a Jewish community founded in the time of the first Beis Hamikdash in an area of Egypt. It was an island on the Nile called Yeb. If you haven't looked into it, very, very fascinating. It was founded in the on the border of what we would call Kush. I think they used to call it Nubia, but Kush. Founded in the times of the first Beis Hamikdash. It had a community there of Jews who lived there. They were not Orthodox Jews by any stretch of the imagination. They built against halacha a temple, a sort of Beis Hamikdash, if you like, for bringing of korbanos there in Egypt. And it's not clear exactly whether they, over the centuries, perhaps became influenced by various polytheistic views also. But we found this from the 1900s and on, an incredible treasure trove of material, of written documents from this community, dating back, as I said, approximately 2,500 years. And amongst them is a ksuva. So it's a phenomenal find in which, again, you see practice somewhat analogous to Torah SheBaal Peh. Now, I showed you last week an image of such a document, and I accidentally showed you the wrong one, for which I apologize. I showed you a marriage document between someone called Ananya and Tamut, which is not a ksuva. It was a whole different story there. Tamut was a freed slave, and therefore it's a whole things going on in this document which aren't relevant. But we have found examples of ksuvas there, including a one between a lady called Mitbachia and dated 24th of Tishri, about 2,500 years ago. So these are other founds that we've got. And I think I also mentioned mikvahs, for example, is just one final example, or two more examples I think I mentioned. Mikvahs, which are found scattered up and down Eretz Yisrael, particularly on the routes to Ola Regel. Did I mention these last week? If someone could just signal to me if did I mention? No, I didn't mention. Did I mention the elephantine papyri at all? I didn't, so I'm correcting myself mistakenly.
No.
Did I mention archaeological finds at all?
Don't think you did.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm getting mixed up about what I got up to. Did I mention Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No. Well, we touched upon Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit, but not the other thing you mentioned.
No. Okay. So I'm whizzing through stuff that I shouldn't be whizzing through. This is incredible stuff. So what do we know about the practice of Torah SheBaal Peh, and how far can we push it back? So again, this is not evidence for Torah SheBaal Peh. I'm not here coming to give a proof of what's an Ikka Emunah. I'm simply attempting to share, number one, as we will do later in the year, the parameters of Torah SheBaal Peh, but also share the sources of what we have that helps us understand the role of Torah SheBaal Peh. Now, I mentioned the sources from those I did definitely do last week. Some of the sources from Torah SheBichsav, in which we see Torah SheBaal Peh, evidence of Torah SheBaal Peh, and we also have external evidence of practice of things which are similar or accords with Torah SheBaal Peh, that pushes Torah SheBaal Peh back approximately, very clearly 2,000, 2,100, 2,200 years ago, and in the earliest sources even 2,500 years ago. So I definitely mentioned last time, I think, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are again from a group which broke away from what we nowadays call orthodoxy, what in those times was the Purushim, the Pharisees. These were a sect that broke off and settled in the Dead Sea, and they attack and criticize their rivals in Yerushalayim. And I think I mentioned the pun, just give me a nod if I did, Dorshei Chalakot. I think I mentioned this pun last time. Yeah, Dorshei Chalakot. So they criticize their enemies, and they make a pun here, calling them Dorshei Chalakot, slippery-tongued seekers, hair-splitting Talmudists, we would say nowadays, punning on Dorshei Halachot, those who are Doresh Halacha, which is, of course, part of the concept of Torah SheBaal Peh. So we find them attacking Torah SheBaal Peh. I mentioned Josephus, I'm pretty sure I did also last week, this one of the great survivors of history, someone who landed on his feet, no matter what circumstances he found himself in, ended up as a Flavius, as an adopted son of Vespasian after having been a rebel against the Roman emperor and Jewish historian and so on. I mentioned last week that his, when it comes to his self-promotion, when it comes to trying to convince the Romans how wonderful Jews are, he's not reliable, but in everything else, he's generally considered a very, very important source. And he shares all sorts of information about the practice of Jews at his time, including a lot about Torah SheBaal Peh, which he takes for granted that this is part of our tradition. So we definitely push this back to 2,100, 2,200. I then went to more ancient sources, and this is what I whizzed through, and I shouldn't have because I thought I said it last week. One of the most important sources we have, which dates back 2,500 years. So we're now 900 years after the time of the giving of the Torah. And we have evidence of practices not mentioned in Torah SheBaal Peh, yet which are taken for granted in the Jewish communities at the time. And one of these is the elephantine papyri, which I mentioned, this collection of Jewish manuscripts dating from about 500 years before the Common Era, from the Jewish community at Elephantine, which I mentioned. In those days, it was called Yeb, this island in the Nile, a community set up, as far as we know, in the times of the first Beis HaMikdash. And amongst those, we found many pieces of evidence about their practice. Not Jews who were living in line with Torah completely, against halacha, as I said, created their own temple of worship and perhaps adopted some polytheistic faith. But we find their ksuva from this lady called Mitbachia, dated 24th of Tishri, about 450 years before the Common Era. So an incredible piece of evidence of Jewish practice, which is not really mentioned in the Torah. The Ksuv is not mentioned anywhere in Torah SheBaal Peh, and yet from Torah SheBaal Peh, we find it practiced already then. Two more pieces then of archaeological evidence that I'll mention, which I should have mentioned last week, and I apologize. The first one on mikveh pools, found dotted up and down the length and breadth of Eretz Yisrael. Definitely next time you go to Eretz Yisrael, add this to your itinerary. You have to go and visit one of these mikvahs. Many of them are found on what they call derech avos. So there's a footpath that winds its way through basically north-south. So it's that's the line, which they call derech avos because it's, as far as we can tell, the path that the avos would have taken. For example, Avraham would have taken as he set out from the south to go to do the Akedah. And we have two reasons or three reasons for knowing this is the path that took. One is from the descriptions in the Torah of the travel routes. The second is because there's really only one logical route to take. As you wind your ways through the valleys of Hore Yehuda to get to Yerushalayim, there's a sort of coherence to which paths you would take. And finally, we certainly think these are the routes that the Olei Regel used to take in the period of the Beis HaMikdash. And along these paths, they've done a lot of excavation and discovered many mikvahs. Now, there's an obvious reason why you would find mikvahs there, because Olei Regel have to prepare themselves for their ascent to Yerushalayim at the time of the Shalosh Regalim. And one of the things they have to do is tovel, is go to the mikvah in order to ensure that they are tahor. And we have records of halachas to do with this. And one can see these mikvahs and they accord with Torah SheBaal Peh understanding of what a mikveh is. And again, let's not forget, the Torah doesn't say anything about how a mikveh should be built. It simply says v'rochatzu, v'rochat b'sora, different language that's used. B'mayim, it talks about mayim chayim, which is a mayon, which is a spring, but it doesn't tell us what the alternative model of collected water is. And here you can find in the mikveh something which accords to the description of a mikveh in Torah SheBaal Peh. There's a number of halachas which only Torah SheBaal Peh tells us. It has to be built into the ground, and this water is built into the ground. It has to be collected in a mikveh without ever having been in a container, and we see that. One can even see channels sort of dug into the ground out of stone to make sort of stone guttering to allow it to flow into the mikveh. It tells us for a minimum size of the mikveh, 40 sah, about 450 liters, and we see these mikveh pools accord to it, and we can see the steps that lead down to the mikveh. And interestingly, unlike modern mikvahs, you have a separate steps down and separate steps up. And the reason is because the Olei Regel were going into this, and they wanted to make sure that the people going down didn't come in contact with the people coming up. The people going down are still Tommy, the people coming up are now hopefully Tahor, and therefore they wanted to avoid contact between these. And again, reference to seemingly evidence for something akin to Torah SheBaal Peh practice. One final archaeological find that I'll mention, and there's more, is found in the city of Gezer. The city of Gezer, which is located on the coastal plain of Eretz Yisrael, sort of southwest of Yerushalayim. And archaeologists have unearthed there a lot of things. Very, very interesting city, again, worth reading up about. And one of the things they've unearthed is stones around the city. Marker stones around the city, and each of these stones is located approximately a kilometer outside the city and marked in Hebrew and in Greek, and these stones date back to about 2,200 years ago, so we're talking about the era of the Maccabeim, and they're marked with Tchum, the word Tchum. Now, Tchum Shabbos is 2,000 amos, about 1,000 kilometers outside the city. And in a Jewish city, that's what you would want to find. People go for a stroll Shabbos afternoon, or they want to walk outside the city, and there's marker signs there marked Tchum Gezer, the boundary of Gezer. which would seem to indicate, again, in line with Torah SheBaal Peh, that they were worrying about marking the Tchum Shabbos. Again, Tchum Shabbos not mentioned anywhere explicitly in the Torah. It says, Al Yetzi Ish Min Komo. Person shouldn't leave their place. How far that is, what exactly that means, doesn't mean you shouldn't go out of your houses at all. There were groups that denied Torah SheBaal Peh, who took it quite literally. You're stuck in your place the whole of Shabbos. We don't understand it like that. We understand you can leave the city, but you have a limit to how far you can leave the city. Alpaim Amar, 2,000 Amos. And again, this seems to be in accordance with this. And there's many other things which have been found which fit in with this. You can go to burial places in the second Beis HaMikdash era. You can see the kanim, the utensils that we're using, and a lot of things which seem to be in accordance with halacha. So this is where I thought we got up to last time, but I apologize. I think I missed out. Maybe I ran out of time. Some of the stuff I wanted to mention. All I'm aiming to achieve here is this is not an attempt to prove or evidence Torah SheBaal Peh at all. There is no evidence. If one wants absolute concrete evidence for Torah SheBaal Peh, there's indicators. Our intuition that there's something sort of bizarre about the concept of an oral Torah. Why should there be two Torahs? As we said, proves not to be an accurate intuition. There's no reason. Every work includes in it a oral component by definition. The evidence we have of a Torah SheBaal Peh of some sort dates back, as I said, maybe as long as 2,500 years, and the Torah itself makes some reference to a concept of Torah SheBaal Peh. Now, before I go further, maybe I just want to use a little bit of time just to reference, again, what we know about the chain of tradition. And I want to share with you a document that someone put together, which is not an academic piece of work, but is a summary of our Masorah, our tradition of what Torah SheBaal Peh looks like. And I'll try a screen share here, just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about. I hope you're able to see this now on your screen. This gives a rough feel for the chain of Masorah in one particular chain of Torah SheBaal Peh. It includes several features. The first feature is that it is the Ashkenazi chain of tradition. So if you notice, for example, it misses out crucial elements. It doesn't have the Beis Yosef in it. It doesn't have Rabbi Yosef Cairo, because I chose in this particular version of it one that goes via the Chachmei Ashkenaz, because that's my own Masorah. I also took it down to my own Rebbe, who I mentioned in my recent interview in the shul, Ramosha Shmuel Shapiro. So you can see here the chain of tradition going through Moshe, Yeshua, Pinchas, Adi, Shmuel, and so on, names that are familiar to us through Tanakh. Then it goes on to names who are familiar to us through the Mishnayos. The very earliest mentioned Shiori Knesset Gedola, Shimon HaTzadik. This particular bridge over here, there's a lot to talk about, the gap between Ezra and Shimon HaTzadik, but I'm not going to go into that now. Through names of Tanoim and Amoraim that are hopefully familiar. And then a shift to the Gaonim, whose names are in general less familiar to us for reasons which, again, I'm not going to go through now. But the shift to the Gaonim, and then on through the Rishonim, and many of these are familiar, Rashi, the Bali Tosfos, down through the Acharonim to the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu Kramer, and on to modern times. So this is a chain of transmission, and again one sees just how the Masorah has been preserved in our understanding of this, as explained. So just a very interesting indication of what this is. So what I've tried to share so far is just a feel for how Torah SheBaal Peh works, and some of the classic, if you like, pieces of evidence that have been brought for it from some of the more recent research. What I would like to do now is spend a little bit of time understanding why there's a Torah SheBaal Peh. So we've spoken about that there is a Torah SheBaal Peh, but why is there Torah SheBaal Peh? I mean, surely if HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to give a Torah, well, first of all, couldn't he make up his mind? How, what's the either give it as a written Torah or give it as an oral Torah? Why give some written and some oral? What's the idea of both of these? Secondly, surely a written Torah has a significant advantage. A written Torah is preserved; it can't become corrupted over time. Surely this is the better the better way of transferring Torah. So this is an important question. Why do we need an oral Torah at all? What's the point of a Torah SheBaal Peh? So this question has been discussed extensively in our Masorah. The first source I know of that asks it explicitly is a Gemara in Eruvin. The Gemara is in Eruvin Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, and the Gemara says as follows: Shema Toma. Maybe you will say, Im yesh behem mamish, if the oral Torah has is essential. Why wasn't it written down? Omicron, it quotes a pasuk in Koheles. The making of books is endless. So this is a little bit of a difficult answer to understand. The concept of the Gemara, I understand. The making of books is endless. You can't really contain all information in any book. It's infinite, it's endless, it goes on and on. But what exactly then is the answer of the Gemara? I mean, if it is endless, if the Torah is endless, then Torah SheBaal Peh, the old Torah, is the same problem. If it's endless, then how do we transfer it orally if we can't transfer it written? And if it's so endless that we're worried about being able to write such a vast body of work, then how is it efficient or reasonable to make generation after generation memorize this vast corpus of Torah SheBaal Peh? So we'll come back to the Gemara a little later to perhaps try and understand what the Gemara is saying over here. Other sources that discuss this are Rabbi Nissim, so he's a Spanish Rishon. He says that the reason why we're not allowed to write down the Torah SheBaal Peh is because it contains explanations of the written Torah, and you can be sure of a better explanation when something is explained orally rather than being written. And again, this is a little difficult to understand. I mean, if you can say it, then technically you can write it. He says somehow by writing it, we worry about its accuracy. When it's written down, then when it's given orally, we can be more sure about its accuracy. In other words, there's a student-teacher dynamic in which the teacher can understand, can check that the student has understood properly, can interact, and somewhere we can be a bit more confident about the accuracy of its transmission. Again, we'll revisit this idea and see if we can come back to understanding a little better maybe what he means. There are two other answers given by later thinkers. The first is by the Maharal, who lived in Prague in the 1600s, and he says that a very intuitive idea. He says, Kodesh Baruch Hashem never wanted the Torah to be written down on books. He says the Torah is not meant to be written on sitting there on the shelf. It's meant to become part of us. The Torah should be written on the tablets of our hearts, it says. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us an oral Torah because he wants us to know it. There's a danger in books. I'm sure many of us have experienced this. Once something is written down, we sort of feel we don't need to know it. It's written down, so it's there on the book. If I ever, on the bookshelf on my computer, if I ever need to reference it, I'll be able to do so. Writing something down is a little bit of a double-edged sword because I sort of feel it's there, it's preserved. Hashem wants us to be the transmitters of Torah. He wants us to memorize it. And then he goes further in this idea. He says he wants us to integrate it with ourselves. He wants it to become part of it. He says the Torah SheBaal Peh is a bris, is a covenant between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the written Torah can never be that. The written Torah is a fixed text. Oral Torah we carry and it becomes part of us. It molds us and forms us into being a certain sort of person. I mean, I heard from one of my Rebbes, Ramosha Shapiro, not Ramosha Shmuel Shapiro I referenced before, but Ramosha Shapiro, who was a Baal Machshava. He suggested an answer to why traditionally through the ages, luchos, we know in front of every shul, on every Aron HaKodesh, the tablets are always indicated as having this sort of curve at the top, this dome-shaped top. And it's very unclear why this became the traditional image of what the luchos looked like. The simplest understanding of the psukim and the Gemara that define what the tablets, what the luchos look like, are that they're square. And probably you've seen in more recent embroidered Aron HaKodesh covers, progresses, or more recent imagery from text, they now show square tablets as opposed to these dome-shaped tops of the tablets. However, there's no doubt that traditionally for hundreds of years, the luchos were envisaged with this dome-shaped top. And he suggested, in a sort of midrashic interpretation, that maybe this was to allude to the pasuk al luchos libecha, the true place where the luchos are meant to be written, where the text of Torah, is meant to be written, are not on the stone tablets given by Hashem to Moshe at Sinai, but rather on the tablets of our hearts. And therefore they chose this sort of heart-shaped image, which was the traditional shape that the heart was drawn in at the top, to demonstrate that these luchos that we're drawing, where we want the words of Torah to be written, are not written on the cold stone luchos habris, the tablets which were given, but were rather written on luchos tebecha, on the tablets of our heart. Anyway, this is the idea that the Maral suggests, that Torah SheBaal Peh is meant to be integrated into us. First of all, we're meant to know it. That which we write down, we don't know. And secondly, it's meant to become part of our personality. It's meant to mold us and form us. Reb Tzadok HaKohen, an early Hasidic thinker, he says a sort of similar idea in reverse. He says you can't compare something which you read, to something which one hears from a teacher. He says speech issues from the depths of the heart, whilst the written word can't capture the same depth. What the idea that they seem to both be saying is that oral Torah is about a relationship. It's about a human-to-human contact. There's so much of Torah that can't be taught from the written word, that can only be taught from a live interaction with a teacher, with a Rebbe, who hopefully can be a role model of what Torah is meant to be, and therefore can teach Torah on a deeper and more holistic level. There's lots of Torah that will be lost if it's just taught from the written word. The Rambam says it's about the molding influence of Torah. The Tzadok HaKohen says it's about seeing the live teacher in front of one. It's about changing one as a personality. It's about learning the example from a living teacher. It's about trying to make the Torah part of oneself. And it seems to me this is really part of what Reb Nissen, who I quoted before, and even the Gemara in Eruvin are trying to say. The Gemara says, "Asos sfarim harba ein kates." It quotes the pasuk in Keheles that if you try and write books, there's no limit. In other words, the things that if you try and capture through books can't be conveyed, whereas the live, living example can capture much more than can ever be written down as a text. I mentioned this in the context of things like shchita. Vocational things are certainly very hard to capture through the written word, and much more swiftly and easily can be conveyed through conversation and example. But the truth is, a whole chunk of Torah is like that. So if we think about a lot of Bein Adam L'Chavero, it has to be holistic, it has to be experiential, it has to be learned from a live person. It's an emotional intelligence of sorts, a halachic emotional intelligence. It's not something that can be taught through the written word, through a formula or through an algorithm. If you want to learn a language as a foreign tongue, you learn it with rules of grammar. Most of us, our mother tongues, our native tongues, unless we're specialized in grammar, we speak a perfectly or almost perfect grammatical English, but we don't really know what the pluperfect in English means. We may know these terms from our biblical Hebrew O-level or GCSE, or from our French studies, but in our own native tongue, we don't really think about these things. We just naturally speak it because we haven't learned it formulaically, we've learned it organically. And the Torah is meant to be taught organically rather than through a formulaic classroom type teaching. The advantage of learning a language, a foreign language in the classroom, is in the sense you learn it accurately, you learn it precisely in a grammatical manner. But the disadvantage is far outweighed by the advantage. You don't speak it like a native, one doesn't live it, one doesn't experience it, one doesn't imbue the culture of it. If one really wants to know a foreign language, one has to go and live with French people for a period of time, and that's how one picks it up. If you go and live with a French peasant farmer, they may know less about the rules of grammar of the language than the lecturer, the professor in the university who's teaching it to you, but you'll pick up a feel for the language far more significant than you can ever pick up in the classroom. And this is what Torah SheBaal Peh is about. It's about this sort of living, organic experience. And lots of Torah has to be taught like that. There's some Torah which can be taught through Torah Shebechsav, through rules, mishpatim, karbonos. You can have instructions, formulae, bullet points about how to give it over. But other parts of Torah have to be taught organically. By the way, this is probably the pshat in the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Shema b'ni Torah semecha, v'al titoy shema b'ni musa vicha, v'al titoy Torah semecha." Listen, my son, to the musa, the rebuke of your father, but don't desert the Torah of your mother. And as the pasuk is saying that the majority of Torah that is taught to a person actually comes through one's mother, not through one's father. So someone lucky enough to be brought up in a frum home will know that the majority of Torah one learns is not actually from texts, it's not from the school, it's not from the classroom, it's from what one picks up at home and just the lived experience. When someone doesn't have the opportunity of learning at home and wishes to grow in their Yiddishkeit and become a Baal Teshuvah, then they'll try and connect themselves to people who are living the living tradition to this day. And to learn what a Shabbos feels like from the Mishnah Berurah is all but impossible. One will learn a vast array of texts but not get the sense of what it's really about. It's the living tradition which gives it over. This is Torah Semecha, that which is lived through the Torah of a real household experience. The Vilna Gaon on this pasuk comments somewhat cryptically, but probably alluding to this idea. Shema b'ni Musa avicha. This is the Torah SheBichsav. V'al titosh Torah Semecha. Don't desert the Torah of your mother. This is Torah SheBaal Peh. So true Torah has to be a Torah Semecha, has to be a Torah which has been transmitted orally and through a living experience, rather than Torah which is transmitted through the written word. I'll just pause here for questions if anyone wants to ask anything, and then I will carry on.
Sorry, Rabbi Zobin, I do have a question. It's Avram.
Hello.
You talk about teaching. It's a slightly off point, but it comes up. You say that Atitosh Torah Mecha, you learn from the mother. We have countless examples of people who open a book and see the chumrah in the book, and they come up to the parents and say, "You're doing it all wrong. This is how you do Torah. Look, it says." And I do think that part of the chumrah that my generation made is that their parents, people in my parents' age, who now would have been in their 90s, they didn't have the ability to learn, and they went and practiced. And then my generation went away to yeshiva and came home and said to their parents, "Look, you're doing it all wrong." And I think there's a bit of Atitosh Torah Mecha there. They went off.
Yeah, I paused for this question actually because I saw your image up here, and I thought you might want to ask this because of some of the conversations we had over time. That was actually the reason I paused for a question, in case you wanted to ask this. It deserves a conversation in its own right, and it's a series I would love to give at some stage about Pesak Halacha and the role of Minhag in Pesak and all these sorts of issues about new chumras or supposed new chumras that come along and things like that. There's also been I'm sure you're aware of this, a very fascinating study from Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, the historian son of Rav Soloveitchik, in which he speaks about the disruption caused in Masorah particularly by the war years. But by that I don't just mean the Second World War, I even mean the First World War. The First World War was an enormous cause of disruption in the Jewish communities in East Europe in particular, and a loss of Masorah. And he speaks about this shift from what he calls a mimetic tradition, a lived oral tradition of minhag, to a text-based tradition, perhaps best personified by the Mishnah Berurah. How to balance these two and what is the correct halachic approach to adopt is very, very complicated. There are practices in the mimetic tradition that get lost and are wrong, and there are minhagim which can't really be justified in halacha. And then the minhagim which absolutely can, and the Mishnah Berurah takes a particular stance, but the minhag was not like the Mishnah Berurah. And the stance that one sort of sees at home and has just inherited from one's ancestry is a perfectly legitimate halachic position. And it's very hard sometimes to tell the difference between the two. And sometimes what one thinks is a very old minhag and says, look, but we've always done it like this, and now you're coming along with one's new chumras, actually is a reversion back to what things used to be in the past. So each case really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. It's possible that the minhag, a common practice, has an absolutely sound halachic basis and is absolutely correct, and this is how Jews did it, and this was the living tradition, and we don't need to look at texts to question it. It's possible it's wrong and it's a mistake. It's possible it's somewhere in between. It's possible actually the texts are restoring a lost tradition. Each case needs to be looked at by itself. What I would definitely say, though, is that if one saw a practice in previous generations, one should give it the benefit of the doubt, meaning before one just assumes it's wrong and that one's now seen a textual, a source in a Mishnah Berurah, another halachic work that says it's wrong, one should check and be sure that one is that this isn't representing a genuine minhag. And anyone who knows the literature of the poskim will know that they took these minhagim very, very seriously. And the big poskim were very reluctant to assume that a widespread minhag was a halachic mistake. This dates back to, you see this in the Rishonim with the Balei Tosfos, one sees this in the Achronim, the whole genre of literature called Limud Zechus, where the poskim try and justify, find merit, Limud Zechus, to find merit in a minhag which is even very difficult to justify halachically. So it's not simple to just negate minhag based upon text because of the power of what academically we call the mimetic tradition, the Torah SheBaal Peh. Having said that, there are cases where it gets it wrong also, and a living tradition can mistakes can creep in, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the reliability and accuracy of Torah SheBaal Peh and on what basis we rely on it. So there's not a black and white answer to your question. In brief, it really depends on different situations.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's the those are some of the sources, and I'm suggesting that the Gemara, which says "Asos safarim haba ein kates," there's no limit to the making of books, means this also. It means that a living tradition is in some respects a better way to carry information, particularly experiential halacha, particularly given that halacha is meant to mold one and form one into a certain sort of person. There is, by the way, one other set of sources around this idea of Torah SheBaal Peh, which is on midrashically found, particularly in the Medrash Rabbi literature, and I mention that for a reason. And the Medrash Rabbi, in several places, says that the reason for Torah SheBaal Peh is to keep it away from the non-Jewish community. So Torah SheBichsav is accessed by everyone. Torah SheBaal Peh is only for Jews. Now, this seems to be a very different answer. It doesn't seem to be connected to the previous answers. And there's probably an interesting historic reason why this explanation came to the fore in the Medrash Rabbi. Again, without going through the whole history of it, the Medrash Rabbi was its text was finalized in Christian lands after the switch of the Roman Empire to Christianity. And of course, Christians claim to have the same Torah as us. And our response is, well, yes, you have part of your Bible is, of course, the Torah, but you only have the Torah SheBichsav. You don't have access to the Torah SheBaal Peh. And we know that there's millennia of Christian persecution of the Gemara, the Talmud, and dislike of it because it's taking the Torah and taking it in a different direction to the way they wish it to be taken. So the Medrash may be coming from a back connected to that historical fact. But it seems to me, again, the idea is similar. Why shouldn't non-Jews be able to learn the Torah SheBaal Peh? I mean, if they're able to learn the Torah SheBaal, why shouldn't they learn the Torah SheBaal Peh? Also, why shouldn't we want to share it? And I think the answer is not so different to the previous answers we said, which is we only want Torah SheBaal Peh to be learned by someone who's willing to learn it holistically, to be molded by it, who sees this as a relationship, a living covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as a part of what we are and forms us as human beings. And therefore, if one wants to learn Torah SheBaal Peh, then welcome, join the Jewish people, enter into that covenant, allow the Torah SheBaal Peh to mold you and form you into being a certain sort of person, and then that's absolutely fine. Then there's no problem with having it as your text. But to be learned by those who are not B'nai Bris, those who choose not to enter into the covenant, who don't want to be molded by it, that we don't want access to Torah SheBaal Peh to be there. So in brief, what we've spoken about so far is Torah SheBichsav is a fixed text. It has the advantage of being written down. It doesn't need memorization. It perhaps has an accuracy to it. However, it misses all these characters of Torah settling on us, forming us, molding us into a certain sort of person. Now, there is another reason for Torah SheBaal Peh, a very, very important reason, which I'll comment to in a few moments. But before I come on to that, I want to discuss another question over here, which is, has all of this been lost now that Torah SheBaal Peh has been written down? We've written Torah down in Gemara, in Mishnah. Has it all been lost? Have we lost this oral tradition to Torah? And the answer is, and this is pointed out by thinkers as far apart as Luzzatto, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, and Samson Raphael Hirsch in his commentary to the Torah, that the oral Torah remains oral. Anyone who learns Gemara and Mishnah will know that it's note form. It really is only headlines. It gives us a sample of what Torah SheBaal Peh has to say, but it can only be learnt through a continued relationship to it. And this is why Torah SheBaal Peh, it continues to need shiurim to deliver it. Gemara is an all but incomprehensible text. text without being filled in. There are modern phenomenal Sepharim, recent translations of the Gemara, whether Art Scroll or the Koran or Steinsaltz and others, that have made it more accessible. But nonetheless, beyond a relatively surface understanding of what Gemara is saying, it still remains profoundly oral. And there's an important reason for this, and perhaps leads us to the most significant answer as to why the Torah SheBaal Peh remains oral, and it's important that there's a Torah SheBaal Peh. And this is really an introduction to what we will discuss next week. And the most profound answer, I think, to all of this is that Torah SheBaal Peh is what's necessary for the resolution and understanding of Torah SheBichsav, and adds a contemporary lived human understanding to Torah SheBaal Peh in each and every generation. And if you want a system which on the one hand has absolute values to it, and it would be recognizable between each generation, so that hopefully any of our great-great-grandparents wouldn't look at us and say, this isn't the Judaism we knew, this is like a completely different faith on the one hand, and yet on the other hand can adapt and apply to new circumstances, then the balance between Torah SheBichsav and Torah SheBaal Peh is a brilliant one. Because Torah SheBaal Peh ensures that each generation needs to relearn it. And in fact, with the writing of Torah SheBaal Peh, which was necessitated by historical circumstances and the forgetting of Torah, and therefore Rabbi Yotam Nossi had to write it down as Mishnah, the Talmud had to be canonized, Shulchan Aruch had to be canonized, we've lost something in our Yiddishkeit, which is that the Torah isn't completely Baal Peh. And there's elements of halacha which are fixed. And that's the way it had to be. This is what happened. But the purpose of Torah SheBaal Peh is to take these halachas and be able to apply them anew and afresh in each generation. Now, this is there on a very pragmatic level. If you think about the advances of technology. So there is there's no possibility of a Torah SheBichsav which can tell us anything meaningful about electricity. There couldn't have been a verse in the Torah which said, thou shalt not use electricity. And for all the generations, Rabbi Kiva would look at Rabbi Shimon and say, electricity, no idea what that means, never heard of it. Rava would look at Tobias, say electricity, we've got no idea what that is. Until finally the pasuk would become comprehensible in the 19th or 20th century. This isn't conceivable. The Torah gives us principles which we then need to apply into the modern circumstances. And I'm using electricity as an example of a very well thrashed out halachic concept. But of course, all the recent developments, whether it's in cloning and fertility treatment, whether it's in use of communication and automatic machinery and the like, all of this has been taking the principles of Torah and applying them to new circumstances. And then we get shifting in morality and moral sensibility and social norms and other things. And the degree to which Torah has to be adapted and molded to every new generation of mind is probably the most significant reason why Torah SheBichsav can't be it, why there also needs to be an element of Torah SheBaal Peh. Because Torah SheBaal Peh calls on us in each generation to receive the Masorah, to receive the tradition, and then think how to apply it and adapt it to the way we think, to the way our minds work. And this is something really miraculous in how Torah operates. And I've said this before and I'll say it again because I can't repeat it enough. It's an amazing thing. One of the most remarkable features of the halachic system is how by taking dry and abstract halachic principles, it provides for us halachas that to clearly work in the modern age. And this is not because of, often, it is not because of conscious thinking about how do we adapt to modernity. It's very often just by applying the rules of Torah SheBaal Peh. And the most vivid example of this, as I said, is electricity. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, as electricity was thrashed out, every serious posek came to the conclusion that one can't switch on and off electricity on Shabbos. Because of Makib Patish, because of Boina, because of Mavir, whatever the halachic mechanism is, but through the dry application of halachic reasoning to switching on a 15-watt light bulb, flickering light bulb in a hovel in East Europe, they came to the conclusion that electricity could not be used. And it was like a bus call, like a voice from heaven was heard. No one at the time said, let's not use electricity because we'll need an electronic detox from the craziness of emails and social media and everything else. And yet now in the 21st century, we look at this and we say Shabbos is only Shabbos. The essence of Shabbos is because we can't use electricity on Shabbos. And without it, Shabbos quite simply wouldn't be Shabbos. It's so fundamental to what it is. And this is not because someone sat down and said, well, what's Shabbos? And, to preserve the atmosphere of Shabbos, we need this. Quite the contrary. Switching on lights would have been seen as an enhancement of Shabbos. So the application of dry halachic reasoning resulted in a revelation of new Torah that hadn't existed before, the Torah of electricity, which clearly preserves everything that is essential about what Shabbos is trying to do in the modern age. And this is like a ripple of stone that was dropped in the pond. Sinai should be viewed as a stone dropped in the pond that creates ripples that continues to reverberate through the generations. And we can hear that echo of a voice, the baskol, that still comes out of Sinai in the midrashic image that's used by Chazal to describe a baskol, a voice that comes out of Sinai that can still be heard. So this is probably the most significant dynamic at work in Torah SheBaal Peh, which is by forcing us to receive Torah anew every generation. We have to understand it. We have to apply it. It has to settle in the modern mind, the 21st mind, and this is what allows Torah to balance both a faithfulness to the Masorah and also an application to modernity. And I don't just mean modern technology, but I mean a whole modern way of thinking. So I'll stop there because I've run out of time, unfortunately. In Mitzvah Hashem, next week we will explore this more fully. So what is Torah SheBaal Peh? What's its parameters? What's included in it? And this will help us revisit, come back to this idea of the concept of Torah SheBaal Peh being there partly to help us apply Torah to modernity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I wish everyone
Thank you.
a good day. And apologies if I need to.
Thank you.
Need to cut this
Thank you
short.
very much. Shkoyach.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.